A poor peasant girl is invited to play the violin to humiliate her. But her talent leaves the prince in shock. The scouring pad bit into her knuckles, scraping over already raw skin as Anaïs Morel leaned over the copper basin to rinse another pot. Her hands, pale and narrow, were red from heat and lye. Steam curled upward and disappeared into the rafters, mixing with the scent of boiled cabbage and mutton bones that seemed to permanently cling to the stone walls. The kitchen floor was slick from the morning's water spills, and somewhere behind her cook barked an order at a scullery boy, who promptly dropped a tray of pewter goblets with a clatter loud enough to make the floor tremble. Anaïs didn't flinch. She never did. Flinching drew attention. Her fingers curled tighter around the scrub brush as she worked the rim of the pot, her shoulders tucked in, her elbows close. She moved like someone born to avoid notice, efficient, silent, absorbing the rhythms of labor without protest. Over the years, she had learned that invisibility was the closest thing to safety in a house like Winterbourne Hall. She rarely spoke unless asked. She never corrected the way they mispronounced her name. The smell of ash and snow drifted in from the narrow window near the hearth, where the frost crusted thick along the panes. Outside, the world was colorless and still. Snow had fallen all night, turning the fields into a silent sea of white. The trees lining the driveway, tall and old, stood bare and black, like skeletal fingers against the pale sky. But inside, the kitchens pulsed with heat and chaos. "They've sent up the good silver," one of the footmen muttered as he passed through with a crate of crystal. "Every knife polished. Must be a bloody coronation." "Not a coronation," Cook snapped, slapping a ball of dough onto the board. "It's the master. Back from Italy, or wherever it was he ran off to." Anaïs kept her head down, but her ears strained toward the conversation. The master, Lord Everard Sinclair, a name rarely spoken aloud in the servants' quarters, and never without the weight of mystery. "He hasn't been back in nearly a decade," someone whispered from the pantry. 10 years, and not a single letter. "They say he's gone half mad, lives alone, refuses visitors. They say he killed a man in Florence. They say his mother's death." "Enough," barked Cook, slamming a ladle against the side of the pot. "Your work doesn't care what he did or didn't do. Get those ducks basted and mind your tongues." The room fell into a tense, bustling quiet. Orders were shouted, vegetables chopped, ovens opened. But beneath it all ran a current of unease. The return of the heir was no ordinary event. Formal dinners at Winterbourne were rare now, their grandeur faded with the years. Lady Montcliffe, Everard's aunt and mistress of the house, had ruled the estate with cold precision in his absence. Her expectations were high, her punishment swift, and tonight she intended perfection. Anaïs finished rinsing the final pot, setting it on the drying rack with care. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to reach for the next task, when the kitchen door swung open with sudden force. A gust of cold air swept through, and with it came the steward, his coat dusted with snowflakes, his cheeks red from the cold. "Morel," he called, his voice clipped and formal. She straightened. "You're to report upstairs, now." A brief pause. Cook raised her head from her dough, her brow knitting. "For what?" The steward didn't look at her. His gaze remained on Anaïs, impersonal and unreadable. "She's to bring the violin." Anaïs froze. Her hands, still damp, curled at her sides. The kitchen's noise dulled around her, as if she were suddenly underwater. A few of the kitchen maids exchanged glances, their expressions puzzled. One of the footmen snorted softly. "The violin?" Cook echoed, incredulous. "What in the name of St. Peter does she want with that?" "She was specific." The steward adjusted his gloves. "Her ladyship wants Miss Morel dressed and upstairs by 6 o'clock, in the music room, with the violin." No one said anything after that. Anaïs couldn't move. The sound of the word, violin, was like a chord struck in a forgotten chamber of her mind. She hadn't played in months, possibly longer. The instrument was hidden beneath her cot in the attic quarters, wrapped in muslin, untouched and unspoken of. Very few people at Winterbourne knew it existed. Even fewer had ever heard her play. The steward turned to go. "Don't be late," he said over his shoulder. Cook stared at Anais. "What foolishness is this?" she demanded. "You've brought no trouble to my kitchen, have you?" Anais shook her head. "Go, then," Cook muttered. "If her ladyship wants you made up like one of her curiosities, best not keep her waiting." She left the kitchen without speaking. Her boots clacked softly on the servant's stair as she ascended 2 flights to her attic quarters. The narrow hallway was unlit, the walls bowed and cold. Her fingers were stiff with nerves as she unwrapped the instrument. The violin looked smaller than she remembered, its varnish dulled, its strings loose with disuse. She held it for a moment against her chest, her heartbeat echoing through the hollow wood. They would laugh. That was the purpose. Lady Montcliffe's instructions were never what they appeared to be. She would seat her among velvet chairs and damask drapes and watch as the servant's girl tried to mimic an art that did not belong to her. The violin was not a symbol of refinement here. It was a trick, a spectacle, a blade concealed in a bouquet. A housemaid came with a bundle of borrowed clothes. "Dress quick," she said, trying not to meet Anaïs's eyes. "She's asked for you to be clean." The gown was a faded silk in cornflower blue, too tight across the chest and too short at the wrist. It smelled of old lavender and starch. Anais let the maid plait her hair back loosely and pin it at her nape. The violin case she carried herself, its leather handle worn and The main corridor upstairs was dim, lit by sconces that flickered with gaslight. The house was quieter than she had ever known it to be. No conversation, just the distant sound, chairs being and glasses arranged. Every surface gleamed. The hall, had been made to shine for it. A footman met her at the base of the grand staircase and led her without a word down the corridor toward the music room. The doors were ajar. Lamplight spilled through, warm and golden. Anais paused just outside, her back against the wall, her violin case tight in her grip. She could hear the soft murmur of noble voices within, male and female, rich with practiced ease, the clink of crystal, the low hum of anticipation. Then, a voice, one she did not recognize. It was not loud. It did not command the room. But it was unlike any voice she had heard in this house before. Deep, even, deceptively calm. It did not strain for attention, because it did not need to. It was the voice of someone who had once owned everything in the room, and had only just decided to return to it. A servant leaned toward her from behind. "That's him," he whispered, eyes wide. "That's Lord Everard." The music room was a warm, gilded box of sound and light. Gas lamps hissed softly from sconces along the panelled walls, casting a golden glow that shimmered over polished wood floors and the glint of crystal drops from 2 overhead chandeliers. Their refracted light sparkled across every surface. The lacquered pianoforte in the corner, the gleaming brass fire screen, the stemmed glasses of port clutched in white-gloved hands. The air carried the distinct perfume of beeswax, port, and a faint trail of rosewater from Lady Montcliffe's hem as she took her seat near the front, her spine straight as a blade beneath her silk brocade gown. Around her, a collection of titled cousins, landed neighbors, and their carefully coiffed wives murmured to one another in low tones. The conversation was idle, amused. The room had not gathered for music, but for entertainment, and the difference was palpable. They sipped from cut glass. They wore the dark, sumptuous colors of the season, deep greens, dark plums, midnight blue. Their jewelry flashed in the lamplight like punctuation. Their gloves were pale and immaculate. Most had the same expression, somewhere between curiosity and disdain, as they turned to glance at the girl who had been introduced by one of the stewards in an undertone. Anais Morel, from the kitchen staff, at her ladyship's request. A ripple of private laughter passed through the guests, hidden behind fans and smirks. She stood just inside the doorway, near a narrow table topped with crystal decanters. The air was warmer here than in the rest of the house. Too warm, and she felt it catch against her collarbones, prickling under the stiff fabric of the borrowed gown. Her fingers were cold against the leather handle of the violin case, though her back burned with the press of so many gazes. Across the room, near the hearth where no one else sat, Lord Everard Sinclair remained motionless. He was not the tallest man in the room, nor the most elaborately dressed, but something in his stillness, the deliberate quiet of him, made it impossible not to look. He sat in a heavy-backed chair, one hand on the carved wooden armrest, the other resting on his knee. His posture was precise. His legs were crossed loosely at the ankle. His coat was black, his cravat a stark white against a deep grey waistcoat. His face bore no expression. He might have been carved from winter stone. Anaïs did not look at him for long. She could not afford to. Instead, she walked forward slowly, the violin case clutched in both hands as if it were a shield. Her footsteps echoed too loudly in the stillness. She was guided to a position near the pianoforte, where a small footstool had been placed with quiet mockery, as if the idea of her standing among them required added artifice. The laughter had faded, but the amusement had not. She could feel it. Lady Montcliffe gave a slight incline of her head. "Proceed," she said softly, as if ordering the servants to pour wine. Anaïs set the case down. Her fingers trembled as she unfastened the old brass clasps. The hinges creaked faintly. Inside, the instrument rested on faded blue velvet, its body dulled with age, the wood worn where the varnish had been rubbed away by years of playing. It was not beautiful by the standards of society. It bore no fine luthier's mark, no inlay, no shine, but she had polished the fingerboard earlier that afternoon with a clean scrap of muslin. She had tuned it carefully, her ear measuring each string with a musician's quiet reverence. She drew it out gently, pressing the chin rest to her shoulder. No one moved. No one cleared their throat. There was no polite silence, only expectant stillness. The kind that came before someone was meant to fail. Anaïs drew in a slow breath. She closed her eyes, and then, in one motion, so fluid it felt like falling, she lifted the bow, set it against the strings, and drew out the first note. It was low and aching. The sound trembled against the polished walls. It resonated deeper than expected, richer than such an old instrument should have allowed. The tone was imperfect, weathered, textured, full of shadow. It did not belong in that room. It did not belong to any of them. It was the sound of something carried across years and silence, shaped by memory rather than education. The melody emerged without hesitation. French, folk, woven with minor chords and half-hidden harmonies that lingered behind each phrase like smoke. It did not beg for attention. It demanded it. And the room went still. The guests no longer exchanged glances. No one whispered. The only movement came from the slow shifting of breath, the clink of a single glass being set down, the soft ticking of the mantel clock across the room. The song was not cheerful. It was not graceful. It was not meant to charm. It was sorrow, drawn out like thread, careful, intricate, precise. Her bow hand moved without thought, without planning. The fingers of her left hand danced across the fingerboard with confidence born from years of secret practice, from memories of hands that once guided hers beneath the candlelight of a small Parisian room. She played through the first movement with unshaken focus. Something changed in the air. A tension formed, not of discomfort, but of disarmed emotion. She felt it in her shoulders, in the way silence leaned toward her rather than away. Her feet were rooted, her eyes open now but unfocused. She did not look at them. She could not. The second movement rose in slow arcs, more mournful than the first, blooming into gentle dissonance before resolving again, like a question that didn't want to be answered. At the hearth, Lord Everard did not move, but his eyes were fixed on her. He hadn't blinked. His hand gripped the carved armrest more tightly now, his knuckles pale against the dark grain. His chest rose slowly, then stilled again. A line formed between his brows, faint but unrelenting. The bow pulled another phrase from the violin, high and trembling, his jaw tensed. He had heard this before. Not this version, not this arrangement, but the shape of it, the soul of it. Somewhere in some quiet chamber of his life, that melody had once lived. It twisted into him like a splinter. The final note faded into the walls. Silence clung to the edges of the room like breath against glass. It was not polite silence. It was reverent, disbelieving, the kind that no one wanted to break first. Anais lowered the instrument slowly. Her hands were no longer trembling. Her pulse still raced, but her face remained still. She kept her gaze just above the heads of the guests, fixed on the back wall, unwilling to meet anyone's eye. Then, a single clap. Lady Montcliff, measured, sharp. She offered it once, and only once. "Well," she said lightly, her voice brittle with false charm. "How charming." A few guests laughed, uncertainly. The spell had cracked. Anais stepped back, intending to retreat, to lift the violin case, to disappear through the open door before the illusion shattered further. But she stopped. Everard had risen from his chair, not quickly, not with drama. He stood slowly, deliberately. The guests parted for him without thinking, making space where there had been none. He walked with calm, even steps, the sound of his boots absorbed by the thick rugs underfoot. He came to a stop not 2 feet from where she stood. Anais raised her eyes finally. His face was unreadable. His voice, when it came, was low, softer than she expected, not cold, but certain. "Where did you learn to play that piece?" The question caught her mid-breath. Her mouth opened, but no answer came. Her heart pounded, the strings of the violin still faintly vibrating beneath her fingers. She could not speak. He turned his head slightly toward Lady Montcliff. "That melody," he said, "belonged to my mother." The silence that followed Lord Everard Sinclair's words was not the stunned hush of admiration. It was something colder, heavier, like a sudden draft through tightly sealed windows. Several of the guests shifted in their chairs, no longer certain whether they were participants in a parlor amusement or unwilling witnesses to a scene that had not been scripted for them. One man cleared his throat quietly. A woman's gloved fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass. The string of pearls around Lady Montcliff's neck shimmered slightly as she straightened her spine, her lips drawing into a taut, unreadable line. "That melody," she said, with a quick breath and an even quicker smile, "is quite common in some regions of the continent. I dare say it has traveled across more borders than we realize. These peasant tunes do have a way of reinventing themselves." She lifted a hand in dismissal, the gesture graceful, practiced. "It hardly seems a mystery that one might hear something similar while wandering through a village square in France or Italy. Our Miss Morel, I am told, has French blood. Perhaps she overheard it somewhere." Her voice was cordial, but the words landed with sharp, pointed precision. A kitchen maid with a violin, a girl with no claim to the music she played, a servant after all. But Everard didn't look at her. He didn't respond. He continued to stand before Anais, his gaze pinned to hers, the firelight casting faint shadows along the cut of his jaw. His attention had narrowed, not out of rudeness, but necessity. The room, the guests, the murmuring discomfort, all of it had faded into irrelevance. Anais held his gaze, though her breath came shallowly. Her fingers were still curled around the neck of the violin, though her bow hand had dropped to her side. Her heart beat high in her throat, loud enough that she wondered whether he could hear it. She didn't understand what had happened, what she had done. The melody had come without calculation, drawn from memory, from instinct. It had never occurred to her that it might be known by someone else, let alone by the master of the house. His voice had not been accusing, but it had pierced through her. Lady Montcliff stood. "Well," she said with a brittle laugh, "I believe that concludes our entertainment for the evening. Lord Everard, I trust you'll excuse us all while we allow Miss Morel to return to her proper duties?" She didn't wait for his response. She turned to the other guests and nodded toward the doors, which opened quickly under the hands of the waiting footman. One by one, they stood and made their way out, their expressions carefully schooled into neutrality. Whatever private judgments they held, they would not voice them in front of Lady Montcliff. Everard remained in place. So did Anais. When the last guest had departed and the double doors closed behind them, the room fell into an unnatural quiet. The gaslight flickered against the far wall. The scent of wine, wax, and perfume still lingered in the air. "Stay," Lady Montcliff said over her shoulder as she swept out through the smaller side door. "Miss Morell will remain until she is dismissed." Anais did not move. Her legs felt rooted to the patterned carpet, her back straight with tension she could not release. She heard the echo of Everard's footsteps behind her as he walked slowly to the corner of the room, then returned, pacing once, as if struggling to decide what to say. When he spoke, it was not with anger, nor even suspicion, but there was something under his voice, a quiet intensity, too focused to ignore. "Where did you learn that piece?" Anais turned toward him slightly, keeping the violin close against her side. Her voice was quiet, measured. "My mother used to play it." "Your mother," he repeated. She nodded once. He stood across from her, no more than 5 paces away. "And where did she learn it?" Anais hesitated. Her first instinct was to lie, to invent a village, a tutor, a faceless fiddler at a street corner. But the thought of doing so in that moment, beneath his gaze, made her feel suddenly ill. "She never said," she replied truthfully, "only that it was her favorite. She would play it often, especially when she thought I wasn't listening." Everard's expression didn't shift, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Did she teach you?" "Not directly. I listened. I copied what I heard. It took time." He studied her, in silence. Anais kept her chin lifted, though everything in her body urged her to drop her eyes. She didn't mention that her mother had been French, or that her mother had once spoken of an Englishman she'd loved, years before Anais was born. A man who had known music, a man who had, for a brief time, given her something beautiful before vanishing without a word. None of that belonged to this moment. Still, there was something in Everard's face that unsettled her. Not suspicion. Not quite. It was recognition, or something close to it, as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff and trying to remember whether he'd once seen the view from the other side. He opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, the door opened. Lady Montcliff stepped back into the room, her entrance deliberate and unhurried. Her gloved hands were folded before her, and her posture was that of someone who had already decided the outcome of the conversation she was about to interrupt. "I trust we've had enough questions for one evening," she said mildly. "You'll exhaust the poor girl." Everard didn't move. "She should return to the kitchens," Lady Montcliff continued. "No doubt Cook is waiting. I'm sure Miss Morell has been quite the novelty, but we mustn't let her begin to think of herself as anything more than what she is." Anais felt her chest tighten. But then Lady Montcliff turned to her, and the curve of her mouth sharpened. "On second thought, the kitchens are not where she's most useful. A girl with such delicate fingers should be put to better tasks." She turned toward Everard as if offering a gift. "She will assist the upstairs staff beginning tomorrow. The parlor, the library, perhaps my correspondence, and of course the music room, when needed. We mustn't let her talents go to waste." Anais didn't speak. There was no question in the command, and yet, beneath the surface, the words pulsed with meaning. Not a reward, but a warning. She was being pulled into the light not to be praised, but to be watched. Everard's eyes didn't leave hers, but neither did he protest. Lady Montcliff nodded once. "You may go now, Miss Morell." Anais gave the slightest curtsy, then turned, her steps quiet across the thick carpet as she exited through the side door, her violin still clutched to her chest. The corridor outside was darker, cooler. A housemaid waited at the end with a small lamp and a bundle under her arm. "You're to sleep upstairs now," the girl said quietly, almost apologetically. "The green room at the end of the north hall. It's been made ready." Anais followed without comment, her thoughts too loud to leave space for speech. They walked in silence past the main stairwell, along a narrow hallway she'd only ever cleaned from a distance. The gas lamps flickered dimly here, and the carpet muted every step. The doors on this floor were taller, the paneling more ornate. Paintings lined the walls, landscapes, portraits, still lifes arranged in perfect symmetry. When they reached the far end of the corridor, the housemaid opened the last door on the left, revealing a small but well-kept room with a fireplace, a single narrow bed, and a polished wash basin. A folded dress lay at the foot of the bed, and a comb rested on the dressing table. Anais stepped inside and set the violin case gently on the desk. "I'll return for your things from the attic," the girl offered. "The rest of your clothes. Your shoes." Anais only nodded. When the door closed behind her, she stood for a long moment in the quiet, feeling the unfamiliar weight of heat from the fireplace behind her, the scratch of fine wool at her collar. She moved to the window and looked out at the dark, snow-covered gardens, the trees bare and silvered by moonlight. Then she turned to leave, and paused. Down the corridor just beyond the bend, a door stood slightly ajar. The west wing. No servants were ever permitted there. But tonight the door was open. The hallway was darker here, narrower, colder. The gas sconces thinned past the green guest chamber, and as Anais moved down the corridor, the light faded into shadow. The hush grew more complete, the silence pressing gently against her ears like cotton. She hesitated at the bend in the hall, where the familiar floor runner ended abruptly. Beyond that line, the walls looked older, less tended. A faint draught stirred her skirts from beneath the floorboards. No one ever came here. Not the maids, not the footman, not even the steward. And yet the door at the far end was ajar. It shouldn't have been. The west wing. Her pulse beat higher. She told herself to turn back, but her feet disobeyed. Her hand found the banister that lined the wall, fingertips trailing over carved wood worn smooth by decades. The corridor was utterly still. Each breath she took condensed faintly in the air, the cold biting into her skin beneath the borrowed wool of her dress. She reached the door and stood motionless before it. It was open just wide enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. No candle burned. No sound stirred. She leaned in slightly and caught the smell of age, of paper, dust, and something faintly floral, long faded. Pushing gently, she widened the gap and slipped inside. The room was large, not a parlor or bedchamber, but something quieter. A private salon. It bore the marks of a space once dearly loved and long since abandoned. The wallpaper had faded to the color of ashes, patterned with vines now dimmed by shadow. The hearth was cold, its grate filled with old cinders. A harp stood in one corner, its strings coated with dust. 2 chairs sat beside the window, draped in linen sheets, and above the fireplace hung a portrait. She took a step closer. It was the only object in the room untouched by time. The frame was heavy and gold-leafed, the canvas large and vibrant despite the years. The subject was a young woman, seated gracefully, her body turned 3/4 toward the viewer. She wore a dress of pale gray silk, her bodice modest, her sleeves delicate. In her lap rested a violin. Her fingers were poised gently along the neck of the instrument, and the bow lay loose in her other hand, almost forgotten. Her expression was serene, with a trace of distance in the eyes, as if her thoughts belonged elsewhere. Anais felt the breath catch in her throat. The resemblance was undeniable. The woman's hair was the same dark chestnut, worn coiled at the nape in a simple, elegant style. Her skin was pale, her cheekbones gently sculpted, her lips full and undecorated. The set of her brow, the shape of her eyes, even the way her chin tilted slightly forward, all of it echoed Anaïs's own reflection in the copper wash basin upstairs. She stepped closer until she could read the small brass plate affixed to the bottom of the frame. Catherine Sinclair, 1839, 1849. 10 years. That was all. A faint sound behind her made her turn sharply. He was there. Everard stood in the doorway, tall and silent, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the doorframe. The shadows behind him lengthened across the floor, pulling toward the center of the room like spilled ink. He didn't speak for a moment. His gaze moved from her to the painting, then back again. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. She straightened, setting her shoulders into stillness, though her heart raced too fast to conceal. I saw the door open. He stepped inside and closed it behind him. The click of the latch echoed faintly in the silence. He didn't move toward her. His hands remained at his sides, relaxed, but tension gathered in the air around him, as if every breath he took was weighted. "What did you see?" Anais looked back toward the portrait. Her. His gaze lingered on the painting. "My mother." She said nothing, waiting. "She died when I was 11. He crossed the room slowly, stopping near the hearth. "She was a violinist. She composed music she never published. She played in this room, for herself mostly." He looked at Anais again. "That piece you played, the melody, it was one of hers. It wasn't printed, not written down. I haven't heard it since the day of her funeral." Anais gripped the edge of her skirt. The room was too quiet. She could hear the soft rasp of fabric as she shifted her weight. "I learned it as a child," she said carefully. "My mother used to play it. I remember it clearly." I never saw her write it down either. The corners of Everard's mouth pulled tight, though not in anger. His posture changed subtly, no longer distant but sharpened, attentive. "What was your mother's name?" She hesitated. "Marielle. And your father?" She looked away. "I never knew him." A pause stretched between them. He stepped closer, not enough to threaten, but enough to fill the air between them. "Where did you grow up?" "In Paris." He tilted his head. "Before coming here?" "Yes." His questions weren't cruel, but they were relentless. Quiet, carefully measured, and meant to reveal more than she wished to give. "And how did you come to Winterbourne Hall?" She hesitated. "After my mother died, I was sent here. By someone who knew of us." Everard's jaw tensed. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, he glanced back at the portrait. "There are no copies of that melody," he said quietly. "It was something private, between her and—" He trailed off. Anais looked down. Her hands were cold again, curled at her sides. "You must have heard it elsewhere," he said after a pause. "Some variation, or—" "I didn't," she said quickly, her voice firmer than she meant. "It's the same melody. I've known it since I was a child. I don't know how she came by it, only that it was hers, and now mine." He studied her. The intensity of his stare held something more now. Not suspicion, not entirely. There was the echo of something else beneath it, something uncertain, but dangerous in its own right. He didn't question her further. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back and glanced once more at the portrait, his expression unreadable. Then he crossed to the door and reached for the key that hung beside it on a small hook in the paneling. With a faint scrape of metal, he locked the door behind him and turned back to face her. The bells had not yet rung 7 when Anais stepped into Lady Montcliffe's drawing room for the first time, not as a servant delivering tea, but as part of the room's arrangement, placed, not present. The space was immaculate. Pale damask wallpaper lined the walls in soft, vertical stripes, broken at intervals by framed watercolors of Grecian ruins. A pianoforte stood against the far wall, polished to a high shine. The scent of lavender water clung faintly to the upholstery, mingling with the dustless aroma of beeswax and coal. Lady Montcliffe was already seated at her escritoire, her gloved fingers leafing through correspondence with practiced disinterest. She looked up as Anais entered and offered a smile as crisp as the starch in her collar. "You'll sit there," she said, motioning to a low chair beside the pianoforte. unless asked to assist. No speaking unless spoken to. And your posture, if you please. No slumping. Anais inclined her head slightly and crossed the room in silence. The chair was too small for comfort and placed at an angle that allowed her to view most of the room, though not directly participate. A servant's seat, repurposed for display. The message was clear. You may be seen, but not heard. She settled onto it with the grace expected of her, arranging her skirts modestly, her back straight. The first hour passed in hushed conversation. 2 women from the neighboring estate arrived with a flurry of silks and powdered faces, each armed with calling cards and the latest gossip from York. A minor baronet followed, smelling faintly of tobacco and pomade. They made no comment about Anais, but their glances lingered just long enough to remind her she did not belong to their world. Yet she remained there, still and listening, turning pages of music when asked, fetching a paperweight or a quill with soft-footed precision. She became, as instructed, part of the room's atmosphere, no more disruptive than a flower arrangement or the ticking of the mantel clock. Still, she felt the shift immediately when he entered. Everard. His presence altered the rhythm of the gathering, though he said little and lingered near the window, offering only the occasional remark to his aunt. He did not look at Anais, not directly, but she felt his gaze pass over her, once when she stood to retrieve a ledger, once again when she reached for a dropped piece of sheet music. Each glance landed like a touch, measured, inescapable. At luncheon, she did not serve. She stood behind Lady Montcliffe's chair, still as stone, while the family dined in the smaller morning room. Their conversation flitted between hunting schedules, political shifts in Parliament, and the upcoming winter ball in town. But Anais could feel the thread of tension beneath it, taut and quiet, pulling from across the table. Later, as the sky dimmed with the approach of evening, Lady Montcliffe dismissed her with a wave of her hand and a faint, "You'll return before the hour of 5 tomorrow." Anais left with a slight curtsy, her body aching from the careful restraint of the day, her thoughts heavier than when she had risen. The next morning she returned to the same chair, dressed in another faded silk gown borrowed from the storage wardrobes. The colors changed, dove gray, pale mauve. But the cut was always modest, the fit always slightly off, designed to flatter without allowing elegance. That afternoon, another guest arrived. Julian Sinclair. His entrance was more dramatic than Everard's, his manner instantly at ease. He was handsome in a precise, polished way, auburn hair neatly parted, cheeks freshly shaved, a dimple appearing when he smiled. He kissed Lady Montcliffe's hand with elaborate affection and offered warm greetings to the assembled guests. When his gaze turned to Anais, it lingered. She felt it before she saw it. That night, as she walked through the corridor after helping gather the music sheets, she passed him in the stairwell. He stopped, smiled, and introduced himself as if they were equals, as if he hadn't just stepped down from the height of comfort, and she from the edge of invisibility. She nodded, murmured her name. But the way he looked at her unsettled her. His charm was a polished surface, too smooth to see beneath. The next morning he appeared in the drawing room uninvited and stayed too long, asking idle questions that Lady Montcliffe answered with tolerant amusement. And when he suggested Anais accompany him for a walk in the garden, to clear the stillness of the indoors, as he put it, Lady Montcliffe gave her a look that left no room for refusal. Anais found herself stepping out into the cold sun beside him, gloves borrowed, shawl wrapped tight, the gravel path crunching beneath their steps. "Lady Montcliffe tells me you're quite accomplished," he said as they passed beneath the bare branches of a beech tree. "Musical, quiet, a rare combination." Anais said nothing. "She also tells me you're French, or partly." She nodded once. "My mother was French too, distantly." His tone was casual, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. "I've always admired that sense of refinement. I suppose it explains your manner. You carry yourself differently than most of the staff." Still, she didn't reply. "I don't mean to offend," he added lightly. "Quite the opposite. In fact, I find it fascinating. You don't belong to either world, do you? Not quite upstairs, but certainly not below." Her hand clenched beneath her shawl. "I see potential in that," he went on. "Opportunity, if you know how to use it. With the right guidance, the right patronage, someone like you could become quite valuable in a household like this." They turned the path around a frozen pond. The wind tugged at her skirts. Her breath clouded in front of her. "I'm not asking for answers," he said, softer now. "Only suggesting that, in time, one ought to choose a path before someone else chooses it for them." He offered a smile, warm and weightless. But beneath it, she sensed something cold, calculating. They returned to the house in silence. He offered his arm as they approached the steps, and she took it for the sake of appearances, but her fingers barely touched his sleeve. By the time she reached her room, dusk had fully fallen. The shadows stretched long across the walls, and the fire had not yet been lit. She closed the door behind her and removed her gloves slowly, her hands colder than they should have been. On the floor beneath the threshold, folded neatly and tucked just beneath the edge of the rug, lay a single piece of cream-colored paper. No seal. No wax. She picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and unfamiliar. "He is not what he seems. Trust no one above stairs." She stared at the words for a long moment, her heart tightening. Then, from the corner of her vision, a movement. She looked up. A shadow passed silently across the corridor just beyond the open door. Everard. Their eyes met for a single second. And in that glance, she knew. He had seen everything, and he was not going to stop it. The days that followed the note passed in a haze of motion and scrutiny. Anais felt it shift around her, the delicate realignment of her role within the house. She was no longer merely a servant, nor a guest. She had become something else altogether. An ornament placed on display, one whose silence was part of the performance. Each morning she was summoned earlier, dressed in gowns that, while modest, no longer bore the plainness of a maid's uniform. Silk, wool crepe, muted colors in slate and dove and tea rose. Always clean, always precise. She served no meals, scrubbed no floors. Instead, she assisted in music rehearsals, copied correspondence, turned pages during piano recitals, and remained close, always within view, never invited to speak. Lady Montcliffe directed her with the precision of a conductor. A glance meant stand. A word meant leave. The expectations were unspoken, but understood. Anaïs's presence was not to be natural. It was to be curated. In the servants' quarters, the whispers began. "She's in the drawing room again," the scullery maid said one morning, voice hushed as she polished silver. "Not even pouring the tea now." "She eats upstairs," someone else added. "In the corridor, like a lady in waiting." "They say she'll be taught to read Latin next," came a dry voice from behind the linen press. "For church music, perhaps." But what unsettled Anaïs most was not the servants' talk. It was Julian. His manner changed. He no longer asked idle questions or offered compliments with the ease of a courtier. Now, when he entered the room, his gaze sought her directly. He moved too close when they stood together. His remarks became layered, flatteries wrapped around quiet claims. "You play beautifully," he murmured one afternoon, leaning in as he passed behind her. "Like someone who belongs elsewhere." His gaze lingered at her throat, not her hands. The more he spoke, the more carefully she spoke in return. The more he hovered, the more her body tensed. And each time she looked toward Everard, across the table, across the room, across the corridor, she found him already watching. He said nothing. He remained polite, cool, distant. But his silence carried weight. She could feel it in the brief glances they shared when no one else was looking. He never interfered, never interrupted, but his presence became a constant, unspoken echo around her. Late one afternoon, as snow began to fall in silent drifts against the tall windows, Lady Montcliff arranged a private gathering in the music salon. Only a handful of guests attended, those closest to the family, those whose opinions carried weight, the kind who could influence a future match, a social elevation, a decision of inheritance. They arrived in carriages dusted with frost, shedding velvet cloaks and fox fur muffs as footmen guided them through the hall. The fire was already lit when Anais entered. A heavy warmth filled the room, along with the scent of orange peel and cloves. Candles flickered in wall sconces, their light bouncing against the dark rosewood of the pianoforte. Julian stood beside it, sleeves rolled back just slightly, his fingers already testing the keys with idle confidence. "Anais," Lady Montcliff said with a pleased tone, gesturing toward the instrument. "You'll accompany Mr. Sinclair this evening. A duet. He has something special in mind." Anais froze just for a breath. "Yes, my lady." She crossed the room in silence, violin case in hand. She took her place at his left, tuning quickly, her eyes downcast. Julian played the first few bars of a gentle waltz, familiar, elegant, but stripped of any real emotion. His playing was precise, decorative. Anais joined in, the bow gliding against the strings with ease born of muscle memory. Her technique did not falter, but her chest ached with restraint. Julian sat too close. His elbow brushed hers too often. She felt the warmth of his arm each time he shifted. His smile remained fixed, but his nearness spoke louder. The music soared, harmonious on the surface, but beneath it pulsed something colder. When they finished, polite applause followed. Lady Montcliff stood slowly, lifting a glass of Madeira from the mantel. "Exquisite," she said. "A lovely pairing." She turned to the guests. "Don't they make a handsome pair? The grace of old music, the energy of youth. One might almost mistake them for something destined." Anais felt her stomach twist. One of the older guests nodded approvingly. Another woman murmured, "She has presence, with some polishing." Lady Montcliff sipped delicately, then looked to Anais. "With proper guidance," she said, "you might become something truly valuable. If you're obedient." Anais bowed her head, unable to reply. The guests drifted away not long after, and Anais returned to her quarters. The silence of the corridor felt unnatural after so much watching. She was halfway through unlacing her gown when a knock sounded, not from the hallway but from the other side of the wall. A summons. Lady Montcliff. She dressed again with stiff fingers, retied her bodice, and followed the maid who met her at the corridor. This time, the drawing room was empty. Only Lady Montcliff remained, seated near the hearth in a tall-backed chair, her silhouette outlined by firelight. She did not rise. "Anais," she said, her voice soft but sharpened at the edges. "You are not a fool." Anais stopped before her. "You've noticed, I assume," the woman continued, "that attention brings its rewards and its consequences." Anais said nothing. "I offer you protection," Lady Montcliff went on, folding her hands, "and stability, and perhaps a future far better than the one you were born to. But in return, I expect restraint." A pause. "You are not to speak with Lord Everard, not alone. You are not to look at him, not to linger near him. And above all, you are not to allow him, or yourself, to forget who you are." Her gaze sharpened. "You may accept his silence, but you may not invite anything more." The air in the room seemed to tighten around Anaïs's ribs. "You understand, of course," Lady Montcliff finished, "that your presence could undo more than just your own standing, if mishandled." Anais met her eyes, heart pounding. "I understand." The fire crackled. Lady Montcliff leaned back slightly, satisfied. "You may go." Anais returned to her quarters without speaking. The corridor was quiet. The door to her room was ajar. She pushed it open and stopped. Everard stood beside the fireplace, his coat still on, his gloves in his hand. He turned at the sound of her entry, his face unreadable. Everard didn't move when she entered. He simply turned toward her, his gloves still in his hand, the fire casting a faint sheen on the dark wool of his coat. Anais stood just inside the doorway, the chill from the corridor trailing behind her like a second presence. The room was quiet, save for the low crackle from the hearth. Her breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but from the weight of uncertainty his presence carried. He did not offer a greeting. No apology passed his lips. Instead, his gaze held hers with quiet deliberation. "I won't stay long," he said. Anais didn't answer. She closed the door behind her and stepped farther into the room. The fire's warmth reached her gradually, brushing her hands, her face. "I came," he said slowly, "because I cannot stop thinking about that song, and the fact that you knew it." Anais lowered her eyes. Her hands were cold, even near the flames. Everard walked to the fireplace and leaned one hand on the mantel, his posture rigid, his face a study in stillness. "That melody," he continued, "was my mother's. She never played it outside this house. She never wrote it down, never shared it beyond a handful of occasions. And yet, somehow, you know it." He turned his face to hers, not accusatory, but not gentle either. "You told me your mother used to play it." She nodded once. "Yes. My mother," he said, "had a lover, before her marriage. No one speaks of it, but I remember. I heard the arguments. I heard the whispers. He was a musician, French. She refused him, or so the story goes, out of duty to the family. She was married off to my father, but that song, it belonged to them." Anais felt a strange coldness wrap around her ribs. Her thoughts spun in fragments, slow and jagged. "She never told me his name," he went on. "I don't know how long it lasted. I was too young. All I remember is her playing that piece, over and over again, when she thought she was alone." Silence stretched between them. "My mother," Anais said quietly, "once spoke of an Englishman." She saw his expression flicker. She never gave his name either, only that he was noble, that he loved music, that he promised to return. And didn't. Everard's hand dropped from the mantel. He stepped toward her slowly. The space between them was small now, close enough that Anais could see the faint shadow beneath his eyes, the tension at the corner of his mouth. She lifted her chin, though her voice trembled slightly. "I don't know what it means, or if it means anything at all." "Neither do I." The fire cracked softly, sending a sudden glow across the floorboards. "I've tried to dismiss it," he said, "to tell myself it's coincidence, that the tune survived somehow, that your mother heard it in passing. And yet here you are." His mouth twitched, though it didn't become a smile. "And yet here I am." Anais looked down at her hands. "I don't have proof of anything, only memories, bits of stories told in the dark like fairy tales. But fairy tales," he murmured, "are rooted in something." Neither dared to speak what hovered between them. Not just the possibility of shared blood, but everything that came with it. The unspoken collapse of order, the fracture of roles, the truth that could undo them both. He stepped back, as if needing distance to keep control. "I needed to know," he said, "that you hadn't invented it, that it wasn't some performance arranged by my aunt or Julian." Anais shook her head. "No. I believe you." A soft knock struck the door, too sharp to be accidental. Anais startled, her pulse tightening. Everard's entire demeanor changed. He crossed the room swiftly and reached the door in 3 strides. He turned the handle and cracked it just wide enough to admit a voice. "Begging your pardon, miss," came the low tone of a housemaid. "You're summoned to the drawing room. At once." Anais nodded before she fully understood. Everard stepped aside. He didn't look at her as she passed him. Her breath held tight in her lungs. But before the door closed behind her, she heard the faint scrape of his glove sliding back over his hand. The corridor was warm with firelight and tension. Footsteps passed in the distance, muffled by carpet and polished wood. She followed the maid down the stairs and into the central hall, where the sconces had been lit in preparation for evening. Outside, dusk pressed against the windows, soft and blue. The drawing room doors were open. The fire inside glowed high, illuminating every gilded detail, the elaborate ceiling molding, the velvet curtains, the ornate frame above the mantel. Julian stood near the hearth, his smile already fixed, his posture easy. But something in the set of his shoulders betrayed anticipation. Another man stood beside him, unfamiliar, shorter, rounder, with a bald head and gold-rimmed spectacles perched low on his nose. He held a leather folder in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. Julian gestured toward Anais with a flourish. There she is, right on time. Anais approached slowly, unsure of what to expect. Her heart beat louder than her footsteps. Julian turned slightly, the firelight gilding his profile. "Miss Morell," he said smoothly, "I've taken the liberty of proposing a more formal arrangement for your care. One that provides protection, structure, and, of course, elevation." He extended a hand toward the man beside him. "Mr. Hughes has drawn up the necessary documents. Effective immediately, I have submitted a petition to have you made my ward." Anais stared at him, uncomprehending for a moment. Julian smiled wider. "It's all quite legal. You'll be placed under my guardianship. Entirely proper, of course, and most beneficial." Mr. Hughes cleared his throat and held out the sealed envelope. "Once the papers are filed, Miss Morell," he said, "you will be by law under Mr. Sinclair's protection and his authority." Anais reached for the envelope with a shaking hand. The wax seal shimmered red in the firelight. Anais stared at the sealed document in her hand. The envelope was thick, the wax deep crimson, imprinted with the swirling crest of Julian Sinclair's solicitor. It carried the weight of permanence, of silent judgment. She didn't move. Julian stood near the hearth, the glow behind him casting a shadow across his cheekbones. He looked casual, almost pleased, as if this were no more than a thoughtful gesture, a solution to a delicate matter. She sensed it instantly, the control masked as kindness, the calculation beneath the charm. "You're to be congratulated, of course," Julian said, his voice smooth. "Most women in your position would be overwhelmed by such an opportunity." Anais lifted her eyes slowly, keeping her fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the envelope. "Opportunity," she repeated, her voice faint. "It spares you from a precarious fate," Lady Montcliff added, entering the room with a flourish of silk. She moved to stand beside her nephew with theatrical ease, her chin lifted. "There are whispers already. This will stop them. You'll be protected, seen as respectable, and useful." Anais said nothing. Lady Montcliff smiled, and beneath the curve of her lips was steel. "You should be grateful, my dear. The arrangement ensures your future without complications. You'll have rooms of your own, a stipend, music lessons if you wish. Far more than the life your mother prepared you for." Julian interjected with practiced lightness. "And no longer any reason for your presence to invite speculation." Anais felt heat rising behind her eyes, not from embarrassment, but from the terrible clarity of the moment. The plan was not for her benefit. It never had been. She would no longer be a servant, but neither would she be free. The document offered safety, but at the cost of autonomy. She would belong to Julian in all but name, subject to his authority, dependent on his favor. Any attempt to speak out, to question, to move beyond the bounds of his approval would carry consequence. He had turned her into a threat, and now meant to tame her. Lady Montcliff folded her hands. "There's no need to answer now. Consider it. But do not take too long. It is, after all, a generous solution." Julian gave a brief bow and turned to the solicitor, signaling the end of the discussion. Anais stepped back. Her fingers curled tighter around the document as she murmured her excuses and left the room, each step measured, her spine held straight as iron. The hallway outside was dark. Gas lamps burned low. No voices echoed from the adjoining rooms. She moved quickly, down the stairs to the back of the house, across the staff corridor, and into the servants' quarters. Cook glanced up from her receipts. "What are you doing here?" Anais gave a practiced smile. "Collecting my things." Cook's eyes narrowed. "Already?" Anais nodded, voice neutral. "Lady Montcliffe said it was time." Cook muttered something about aristocrats and madness, but said no more. Anais passed through the narrow hallways without stopping, her breath quickening. Instead of climbing to the second floor where her new quarters were kept, she turned down a side corridor that led to the stairs near the archive rooms, a third-floor section rarely used, where the Sinclair family kept old letters, account books, and papers bound in ribbon. It was late. Most of the staff had retired. A thin layer of silence blanketed the upper floor, broken only by the creak of the stairs beneath her boots. She reached the door and knocked softly. The head housekeeper opened it after a moment, her brow furrowed. Her gray hair was pinned in a tight bun, her apron smudged with ink. "What is it?" "I need your help," Anais said. "Please, just a few minutes." The woman hesitated, gaze sharp. "What kind of help?" "Access to the archive." The housekeeper frowned. "Why?" Anais hesitated. "There may be something of my mother's. Something from before." There was a pause. The housekeeper studied her face, the weariness behind her voice. "I knew her," she said finally. "Marielle. She came here once. A long time ago." Anais swallowed. "Then please." The housekeeper hesitated another beat before stepping back. 10 minutes. That's all." She unlocked the door with a small brass key and handed Anais a lamp. "Don't disturb anything you don't need. It's a mess in there." Anais nodded. "I won't." She stepped inside. The archive smelled of old paper and dust, and something faintly floral that had faded with time. The room was narrow but deep, lined on both sides with shelves of boxes, folders, and cloth-bound ledgers. She set the lamp on a desk and began to search. One box at a time, carefully, quietly, letters tied in bundles with ribbon, journals written in a slanted masculine hand, receipts, dull correspondence from estate managers, travel itineraries. Her fingers trembled as she turned over document after document. And then, near the back of the shelf, a letter, unmarked on the outside. The paper was thick and yellowed with age, the seal long broken. She opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, elegant, looping, measured. "Dearest," it began, "I do not write in hope of your return. I know too well what silence means. I only write because I cannot carry you in my heart alone anymore. There is a weight to this kind of grief, the kind that belongs not to sorrow, but to memory. The music you gave me still lives here. I play it, though I should not. I tell myself it is for the child, not for you. But the truth is, when the melody ends, I am lonelier than when it began. She will have your eyes. Of that I am certain. The rest I cannot know." Anais gripped the edge of the desk as the lines blurred. The date was a year before Catherine Sinclair's death. The signature only a single initial, C. She read it again, and again. Her hands shook. Behind her, the door creaked open. She turned quickly, expecting the housekeeper. But it wasn't her. Julian stood in the doorway, a half-burned letter in his hand, the edges still curled with soot. His smile did not reach his eyes. "Well," he said, voice low and edged, "now you've found it." Julian did not raise his voice. He stepped fully into the archive room, letting the heavy door ease shut behind him with a gentle click that felt far louder in the tight hush of the air. He looked at ease, as if stepping into a drawing room, and not into a room thick with dust, secrets, and the echo of a letter that could undo everything. The half-burned paper in his hand trembled slightly from the dying heat of its last flame. The scent of scorched parchment lingered between them. He examined her with the calm precision of someone who had already won. "I would advise you," he said mildly, "to put that letter down before you do something foolish." Anais didn't move. The page in her hand still bore the marks of Catherine Sinclair's sorrow. A confession not meant to be shared, tucked away in time, only now resurfaced, and not, Julian was clearly determined, without cost. "You must understand," he continued, stepping closer, "that something like this, a letter like that, could destroy more than one life. You think it's a piece of history, but it's a blade." His voice remained soft, unhurried. "For Everard, it would mean disgrace. For you, public ruin. For the house, scandal of a kind that does not disappear in a season. Your name would be dissected. Your mother's past dragged out like laundry on a cold morning. And Everard," he trailed off for effect. "He would be pitied, perhaps, or ridiculed, but never trusted again." She said nothing. "You don't want that, do you?" His gaze was steady. "To be the ruin of the only man here who's ever looked at you without contempt?" Anaïs's throat tightened. Julian stepped to the desk and gently set down the remains of the letter he held. Only half the page had survived. Its ink had run where fire met wax. The name of the recipient was gone. He leaned slightly, his voice lower now, almost confidential. "If you care for him, truly, you'll understand what must be done." Anais looked up slowly. Julian reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document and a small leather purse. He laid both on the table beside the lamp, between the scattered pages. "There is a carriage waiting," he said. "It will take you to Kent. There is a convent there, St. Emmeline's, modest, discreet. The Mother Superior has already agreed to take you in, a life of service, peaceful, safe. Not unlike the one you lived before, but far from here." He tapped the purse. "Enough to keep you comfortable until spring. And to remind you, this is not exile. It's mercy." Anais stared at the leather pouch. "This," Julian continued, gesturing to the room, "this would make you a weapon. And you aren't one. You're not built for scandal. Or war." His smile was faint. "You want freedom, don't you? Then take it. Quietly. No one will question it. They'll say you went home, or took ill, or married, perhaps. It doesn't matter. The world forgets girls like you faster than it remembers them." He turned and walked to the door, pausing as he reached for the handle. "I'm not your enemy, Anais, but I am your reality." And then he was gone. The door closed behind him with soft finality. Anais didn't move for a long time. She stared at the letter in her hand, the one she hadn't yet set down. Her eyes skimmed over the lines again, the love buried in them, the grief, the hint of a child never acknowledged. A song passed down, not through bloodlines, but memory. When she could no longer read through the haze in her eyes, she folded it carefully and slid it into the pocket of her skirt. She left the archive room with the purse, the document untouched, and walked slowly through the empty hallways of the upper floors. The snow had turned to rain by the time morning came. She said nothing to anyone. She walked through the house as if dreaming. She stood when spoken to, nodded when expected. She did not seek out Everard, and he did not appear. The rooms of Winterbourne carried on around her, undisturbed, polished, bright with fires. A world that forgot her even before she had left it. At dusk, the carriage waited. It was a modest equipage, no crest upon its door, no sign of significance. The driver helped her up with quiet indifference. She carried only a single bag, her violin, and the letter pressed against her skin. The path out of Winterbourne twisted gently down the slope, through hedges slick with rain, past leafless trees that dripped with fog. The landscape blurred as they rode southward, hedgerows, stables, the edge of the gardens, until the house vanished behind a curtain of grey. She did not cry. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her face still, her eyes forward. The silence inside her had become too complete for tears. Back at the hall, Everard stood at the window of the west wing, staring out at the sodden horizon. His coat was unbuttoned, his hair damp from rain. A soft knock came at the door. He turned. The housekeeper stood there, holding her hands together, her face lined with something he hadn't seen before. Regret. "I believe," she said carefully. "You ought to know something." She explained slowly. Anaïs's absence, the archive room, the letter, the fire. And her voice, as she spoke, turned from caution to sorrow. When she finished, Everard said nothing. He crossed the room, took up his gloves, and walked past her. He descended the main staircase and entered the great hall, where Lady Montcliff and Julian stood near the fire, the air between them too still. He didn't shout. He spoke once, evenly, a single sentence, a statement. Whatever defense Lady Montcliff had prepared died in her throat. Julian paled. Everard's hand clenched at his side. He took one step forward, then stopped. He turned to the butler. "My horse," he said. "Now." The man blinked. "Sir, it's now." Rain pounded the flagstones outside. By the time the stable doors opened, the sky was black and thunderless. Everard mounted without saddle or coat and took the southern road at a gallop, the wind tearing through his hair. He did not look back. The convent was colder than she expected. Not from the air, which was dry and clean, but from the silence. A deep, cloistered quiet that seemed to stretch beyond the stone walls, muffling footsteps, breath, thought. Anaïs arrived at dusk, and the sisters received her with kindness measured by detachment. No questions were asked. A name was written into a registry. A narrow room was assigned. It held a narrow bed, a basin, and a window that faced the edge of the cloister garden. From it, she could see the arches of the gallery and a strip of late autumn sky, grey, unmoving, without direction. She did not speak the first day. Her fingers ached from holding her bag too tightly on the journey. Her dress, soaked from the ride, had been dried and folded at the foot of the bed by the time she woke. The violin case sat on the floor beside her, unopened. No one touched it. No one asked. The second day passed in the same blur. Meals were taken in silence. Morning prayer came and went, marked only by the toll of a bell. Anaïs moved through the corridors like a ghost, her feet never echoing, her breath always measured. The sisters offered her plain food, a place to kneel, a place to rest. But nothing else. It was peace, perhaps, or exile. She couldn't yet decide. She did not cry. Instead, she went into the garden each afternoon and sat on the low stone bench near the wall. The wind moved the bare branches of the old olive trees, and the sky stretched above her like a faded sheet. Her violin remained closed beside her, untouched. Her hands lay still in her lap. She tried not to think. Not of the letter. Not of Julian. Not of Winterbourne, or the drawing room, or the way Lady Montcliff had looked at her. Equal parts disgust and relief. She tried not to remember Everard's eyes. The calm that had always hovered just beneath his silence. The way he had once watched her as if she carried answers he had never dared ask. She failed. It was on the third afternoon that she heard it. Not the bell, not the shuffle of cloth and boots that signaled the sisters returning from prayer. Hooves, distant, rapid. The sound was faint, muffled by wet ground but unmistakable, the rhythm of a single horse moving quickly over muddy road, slowing only as it approached the gate. Anaïs stood slowly. Her heart beat once, hard, then held still. She stepped toward the edge of the cloister, the wind tugging at her shawl. The rain had begun again, a soft drizzle falling across the flagstones. The iron gate beyond the garden creaked open, and then footsteps. Heavy, fast. She turned. Everard stood before her, soaked from crown to boot, His coat clung to his frame. Rain streaked through his hair, down the sharp lines of his face. His shoulders rose and fell with each breath, but his expression was quiet, unguarded. She said nothing. Nor did he. They didn't need to. The wind shifted between them, carrying the scent of rain and pine and something else, a final release of the tension that had lived between them for too long. He reached into the inside of his coat and withdrew a folded letter, water-damaged at the corners, but whole. "I read them," he said quietly. His voice didn't shake. "Your mother's letters, and hers, Catherine's. I know now, everything." Anaïs's breath caught. "You are not her daughter," he said. "Not Catherine's, not mine, not my cousin." The relief came too fast, too sharp. Her knees nearly gave, but she held her footing. "It was my uncle," he went on. "My father's younger brother. He was the one. He left for Paris the same year Catherine stopped playing. The same year everything in the house changed." Anaïs closed her eyes. "I don't care," he said. And this time his voice held the quiet force she remembered from the music room. "I don't care about what they'll say, or the name you carry, or the scandal that might come." He stepped closer. "I only care that you come back." He stopped, letting the rain settle between them. "Not as a servant," he added. "Not as someone I'm sworn to protect. Come back as yourself, as the woman I love." She looked at him then. Really looked. Saw the exhaustion on his face, the soaked hair clinging to his brow, the mud on his boots, the shadow under his eyes that hadn't left since the night she disappeared. He had come for her, not with declarations, but with truth. She stepped toward him, closing the final distance, and placed her hand over his, still clenched around the letter. They left the convent together before the next bell rang. The road north was long and wet, and the horse moved slowly in the dark, but neither of them spoke to hasten it. When Winterbourne Hall appeared on the horizon, its lights glowing faintly in the fog, Anaïs did not flinch. The doors opened without protest. No words passed between them and the staff. No questions were asked. The next morning, Anaïs rose before the sun and walked to the music room. The fire had already been lit. The window opened easily, letting in the soft chill of early light. She placed the violin on the mantel. Then she picked it up. Her fingers moved over the strings without effort, the bow gliding as though no time had passed. The melody that emerged was not the old one. It was something new. And when Everard joined her, standing in the doorway at first, then moving to sit in the chair beside the hearth, he said nothing. He only listened. To the music, to her, to the life they had chosen, one note at a time. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.